let's look at the Hierophant. So if the emperor is the external authority that governs the world, the Hierophant is the analog in the spiritual realm. And remember, I mentioned briefly the analog between the Hierophant and the High Priestess, that the High Priestess is esoteric knowledge and the Hierophant is exoteric. So what that means is, if the High Priestess is about a profoundly internal experience, the Hierophant is about bringing knowledge to everyone, which is why it's often the Pope or the Hierophant. This again refers to the Eleusinian mysteries. The Hierophant, or the High Priest of the Eleusinian mysteries, was one who initiated knowledge in others. The Hierophant initiates knowledge in others. And so you see in this one, oh boy, here's an interesting thing. We're going to have to talk about some differences here. If you look at your Golden Dawn card, wow, how curious. So remember, the Golden Dawn priestess had a grail rather than the Torah. The Hierophant holds the Torah in the Golden Dawn deck. And he is very much the law. He's the spiritual laws. He's the faith, which is the exoskeleton of one's internal experience, right? Does that make sense to you? You know what I mean by an exoskeleton? Okay, so he holds the Torah in this instance. What you have is you have the keys to the kingdom at the feet of the white rate. That's a reference to the biblical text when Jesus says to Peter, "I name you Peter, thou art a rock upon which I shall build my church. I will give you the power to dissolve and to let loose. I will give you the keys to the kingdom." And that's unfortunately kind of a rough translation. I don't remember it word for word. At one time I did, but oh well. So the Hierophant holds the keys to the kingdom. In other words, he holds the keys, meaning those practices which will get you spiritually up to speed. So if this is about service, this is actually about how we can create an order or an institution that will support our spirituality. Or another way of looking at it is, if you're going up the tree, when you get to a certain level of spiritual development and order, and when you've had discipline and you've done practices, you actually are able to move through that to, as a teacher, all the way up to this sort of primordial creativity that we consider the masculine. So that's what the keys of the kingdom are about. You notice that the rams reappear in the Golden Dawn card on the throne. That is again a direct link to the story of Avram. That the Hierophant is the high priest of his people. And it comes from his knowledge of the new dispensation, which is, we do not devour our children. God is a loving God. God is our Father. And he would never require the sacrifice of his children. They both have a crozier, the sheep's crook in the case of the Golden Dawn card, which actually I think is probably a better metaphor. I believe, Alan, I remember when you were doing that paper and we talked a lot, and he got me thinking about the fact that in biblical texts there's often a shift where you move from sheep herding metaphors to agrarian metaphors, the sheep herding being the older of the two. And that's an interesting metaphor. So this has to do with the protective paternal nature of this, that the Hierophant or the high priest is a good shepherd to his flock. He keeps us out of trouble. When we fall, into the bushes of heresy, he comes and hauls us out. When we stray from the path, he finds us.
It also, I think, is somewhat of a telling metaphor of what sometimes those higher authorities think of the people they're leading, too.
Yeah,
Simply
exactly.
sheep.
They're a bunch of sheep.
Yeah.
But, that's the negative underbelly of this card.
Yeah.
The underbelly of this card is a kind of authoritarian, I know better than you, do it my way. Or it's being attached to the black and white thinking of exoteric doctrine. So when people get this card in a positive sense, it can be really learning to acquire spiritual disciplines and practices which allow you to actually raise yourself up in consciousness. Or it can be an attachment to the external forms, fundamentalism. you know, where you just, you know, you mistake the outer for the inner, right? That's the underbelly of this card. One of the things that's really interesting about this card too, though, is, and he wears a triple crown. In the case of the Golden Dawn, it's a really old one. It's the ziggurat crown of Sumeria. And I don't know what the heck this Rider Waite thing is, but you have the sheep's crook on the Golden Dawn, and you have a different kind of crozier that's I forget what that is. So look it up. You'll have to look it up. Sorry about that. And can't remember everything, unfortunately. So when this card shows up, one of the things that it's about is, as I said, in a positive sense, it can mean one of two things. It can be that one is acquiring spiritual disciplines, practices, things that will allow oneself to lead a more spiritual life. It can be about entering into a more spiritualized existence. The other way that you could view it is that you're going to become a teacher, a hierophant, where you teach others and you become a sort of a mouthpiece for others. And which is interesting, by the way, because the letter associated with this is Vav, which is the third letter of the Tetragrammaton, and it's the letter that represents the air. It's the intellectual structures and systems. But what it means in Hebrew is a nail or a hook. So those practices are a hook upon which you can hang things. They nail down certain attributes within yourself. So that's an important thing. So it can represent also one becoming a teacher. And it can also represent becoming overly attached to the forms of faith rather than the high priestess, the inner. And it can also mean, in a really negative sense, you can be a real authoritarian SOB, right? So that's that. All right, moving right along here. The Lovers. For this, I really want you to pick up your colored sheet with the Lovers, because this is one of those cases where the Golden Dawn variation is a very important one. Oh, I love that. That's a beautiful picture. Okay. Although I will say, when you read Robert Wang, he goes on about how, you know, this is the true depiction and everybody who goes with this are a bunch of morons. You know what? If you really understand the inner nature of the Rider Waite card, they're not very different. But let's talk about that and what that means. So now we've gotten past another pair, and now we're coming to yet this pair, which I'm going to jump ahead a tiny bit, which is the Lovers in the Chariot. And you're going to think to yourself, well, how are those two things alike? And if we look at where they are in the tree, we have the Lovers going from Binah to Tiferet, and the Chariot going from Binah to Gevurah. So here and here, right? So now we have that form, that first form, that idea form, in both cases having to cross the abyss, right? Because you're jumping down to below the abyss, right? And the Lovers is where it takes us down to the Tiferet, the place of divine service. Or if you look at it alternatively as going up the tree, it's where you have been willing to really truly give yourself in an unselfish way, and then that leads you up here to the great supernal mother, Binah, which is one way of looking at it. And the Chariot is about moving from Binah down to Gevurah, which is, again, you know, that confrontational energy and force. And it's through a process of active self-confrontation that we can ascend to the supernal mother. Both of these cards are about discipline and awakening. One is through the force of inspiration and desire. That would be the Lovers, which is why it's called the Lovers. And the other is through, this goes back to the golden verses of Pythagoras, establish high thy mind, that best of charioteers, establishing high the mind. Two aspects. And in both of them, one can ascend to the primordial feminine, right? So let's talk about the first of them, the Lovers. I love the card of the Lovers. It's, again, we'll talk about that. It's the Lovers is attributed to the Hebrew letter Zayin, sometimes spelled Z-A-I-N, but I put the Y in. That's a more typical spelling, which means sword or weapon, which is very interesting when you think about lovers. But it's a sword that can cut both ways, as we say. And this is a very, very interesting card. It's also ruled by one of the zodiacal signs of the zodiac. Guess which one? Gemini. The twins, right? All right, so I'm going to start with this card, and then I'm going to move to the Golden Dawn. So this card has two figures on it. You have a man, which represents Adam in a sense, looking at a woman who represents Eve, and the woman is looking up at an angel, and the angel is blessing the man and the woman. And then you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right, behind the woman. So now we're going back to remember when we talked about the innocence of the fool. What we're looking at here is, again, we're returning to that incredible myth that generates so much of Western thought, the Adam and Eve myth. But of course, the mistake of that myth is to look at the descent into matter as the fall. It is a fall in the sense that we fall from our knowledge of our contact with the divine at some level, and then we have to recover that. But in terms of Kabbalah, moving into embodiment was a part of creation. It was part of the whole intent. So the difficulty is when we descend into matter, we often forget our divine origins. The man looks to the woman. This is about the internal masculine and feminine. The internal feminine, or anima, being the soul. One looks to the soul. The soul, in turn, has to look to the higher self, which is the angel. And it's through that process that we reawaken our divine consciousness and we overcome the fall into matter. So this is about love, but it's not just the love of like a man and a woman. It's about the love or the union of the male and the female within the self. It's the divine alchemy of uniting the yin and the yang, the animus and the anima, consciousness and matter, spirit and matter. And that's what this card is really about. It's about awakening. It's about remembering. Now, one of the Gnostic versions of the Adam and Eve story is very, very interesting because, of course, the serpent on the tree of life, far from being evil, is actually the force of evolution. Because if Adam and Eve had not eaten of the fruit, then we would have remained like Persephone before her descent into the underworld. Innocent, perfect, beautiful, unawakened. Unawakened. So the serpent is actually the bringer of knowledge, which is why serpents and dragons are associated with sexuality, also language, also awakening. And the serpent kind of tricks us into waking up. So that's a very, very, very interesting piece. Now, when we look at the Golden Dawn card, we see another depiction of the same thing, actually. So Andromeda is the feminine figure, and Andromeda, who represents the soul, is chained to the rock of matter. We're stuck in physical bodies, and she's being threatened by the dragon, which is another version of the serpent. But in this case, the dragon represents the animal sexual unrestrained nature, unawakened sexuality, unawakened animal energy. And Perseus, who represents the rescuing hero, is the descent from the heavens to rescue Andromeda. And this is again about love. This is a bit more patriarchal version, interestingly enough, in my opinion, where the woman is identified with the unawakened, the asleep, the body, the material, which of course is also sometimes the case. But the man is the awakened spirit, rescuing us. But same myth, really. Just different ways of looking at the same thing. But so it's very important. So she's chained to her physicality. She has to be awakened and rescued. Otherwise, and think about all those myths and fairy tales about princes and heroes who have to rescue girls from dragons. And by the way, what is a dragon? We all know what a dragon is, right? It's the penis.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, certainly in Chinese medicine, and definitely in Western alchemy, dragons, crocodiles, those are woohoo. It's that, but the thing is, it's sexuality, and it has a good and a bad. If it's unrestrained or unenlightened sexuality, then it just ties us into the cycle of baby making and matter. Or it can be awakened sexuality, which is tantra, and then it's an awakening force. And so there's all this stuff about dragons and lions, and in Taoism it takes the form of white tiger, green dragon, right? So that's sexuality, that dragon. But sexuality is an essential part. So the idea is when he frees Andromeda from the dragon, it's not that sex is bad. It's just that you don't want to be eaten up by it. It has to be purified. Has to be enlightened. So that's part of the alchemical ideal. The same idea here in this card with love. What you have is the man, who in this case represents the more outer, has to look to the inner soul, which in turn has to be inspired by the higher self. Love is a great awakening force. This card can show up in a reading, meaning it can be about relationship, but if it is, it's about the awakening ability of a relationship, because one of the ways we do this is internally within ourselves. We marry the yin and the yang within the self. We also do it by exteriorizing that process in the other, right? But the problem with that is that when we exteriorize it in the other, especially if we're working within the context of more standard mainstream sexuality, we tend to get confused by the whole gender thing, and we forget that we are all male and female. So it really doesn't matter what body parts are, whether it's a guy with a guy, a girl with a girl, a guy with a girl, who cares? It's yin and yang, the exchange, the insemination of being. So that's a very, very important thing. So that's what the card of the Lovers is really about. And if we look at why sword, well, it's a sword that can cut both ways. So love can awaken us, or we can get lost in the emotionality of it. Swords are about mind, right? So we need to have that clear, sharp discrimination. Otherwise, we get lost in the emotionality of it. We forget who we are and what we are. And again, if we look at this pathway, it's through unselfish love, divine, illuminated love, that we are inspired and we rise up and we become the great mother, which is the archetype of the soul. It's the great soul, the great supernal mother, the archetype of the soul. Just as Hokmah is the archetype of creative force, this is the creative soul that gives birth to knowledge, awareness, everything, all things come from the supernal mother. Make sense? All right, let's go on. I'm really moving, but we really have to. Let's go to the Chariot. All right, I'm trying to get this card in my hand. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me say one more thing about the card of the Lovers. One of the stories that so there's the Andromeda story. There's the Adam and Eve story. The third thing that you should remember is this is firmly rooted in a medieval notion called courtly love, which is greatly misunderstood by most people. If you read Chaucer's Romance of the Rose, if you read any of those medieval romance, you get it. But courtly love so here's on the most superficial level what courtly love was about. We all have this picture of courtly love where it's like, oh, the knight adores the lady, and the lady of the castle, and it's Lancelot and Guinevere and all of that, but really, if you looked at how that whole culture, that courtly love, which came out of Provence, by the way, where that whole thing came from, it came from the fact that this was the sort of high Middle Ages where they were, power was beginning to be localized more and more in the hands of certain courts. And the idea was, you sent the young men to the court of your local lord in order for him to be kind of educated and turned into a knight. Another way of looking at this was a bunch of testosterone-laden young warriors were showing up with bad table manners and a tendency to rape, pillage, and plunder. So they sort of had to do something here, right? So what the idea of courtly love is that the young men were invited, in a sense, to fixate upon the lady of the castle. She didn't sleep with him, mostly. But the idea is that through this feminine influence, they were civilized. That energy was harnessed to an ideal. This is totally the underlying underpinnings of the Arthurian myth. Guinevere is the civilizing influence. The Round Table took all those knights and said, no, might is not right. You have to take all this male energy and harness it to something that is serving a higher ideal. That was the whole notion, right? The breakdown in the Arthurian myth is that the Guinevere was demoted from her status as sacred queen and instead was subject to a patriarchal authority, which of course then it all ran amok. And there is the crucial thing, but that's another whole story. I could go into that at great length, which I have no time for. But remember that courtly love. It's the idea of the civilizing force of love to take this rampant, strong energy and harness it to an ideal. That's what it was all about. And it's through sexual desire. So what makes that young knight willing to learn table manners and stand up straight and be polite and help ladies across the street and stuff like that? He's in love. He wants to show his best face. Right? All right. So, but that's about all of the male in all of us, right? Now, let's talk about the chariot. Establish high thy mind, that best of charioteers. This, of course, picks up many, many, many myths, including the myth of Helios, the sun. And there's Icarus. There are a lot of things. But anyhow, the chariot is ruled by Cancer. It's one of our zodiacal signs. And its path on the tree is between Gebra and the supernal mother, Binah. And this is about one's need to confront oneself and to harness oneself to the higher ideals. So it's interesting. In the Lovers, it's about our connection, in a sense, between the union of opposites. The chariot is about the mind establishing a kind of discipline, putting the higher self in control. And it involves a process of self-cultivation, self-confrontation. So the Lovers is all about leading us forward through desire and love. The chariot is about discipline. Discipline. And why? The Hebrew letter is heth, a fence or enclosure. Right? You have to put a sturdy fence around yourself. You have to give yourself limits and containments. This card is all about that. The two sphinxes represent, and in some cards, I believe in the Golden Dawn, it's two horses, but they're white and black, pretty much in everybody's deck. And that represents the different aspects of the self. You have to harness the unconscious and the conscious, the mind and the body. You have to get everything moving in the same direction. You establish the higher self, put it in control, and it creates the form in which you can grow and move forward. In the positive sense, this is a card about discipline. And it's triumph, it's victory. It's where you really have yourself in hand. It can also be arrogance. It can be, if one doesn't go through that constant process of self-confrontation, one becomes arrogant. And that's where Gevurah can sometimes be a very destructive force. You think you know better, and boy, you're going to set the world right. And you know, that's where revolutionaries do things like in the Russian Revolution, where they just slaughtered all of the aristocrats. They just took them out and shot them. And they shot a lot of people, actually. Revolutions can be really a bad thing, because they often can represent this card run amok, where now that you're in control, you're going to fix things, and that's just fine to off other people while you do it. The Sphinx is an interesting variation. The Sphinx is the guardian of the gates of the mysteries, and so there's that notion also. Think about the Sphinx as, you know, the riddle of man. You know, Sphinx asks, there's the riddle of the Sphinx. You know, what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in at noon, and 3 at dusk. It's man. You know, you start as a baby and you crawl, and then you stand upright, and then you walk with the king. But it's about the fact that, once again, you know, one has to harness the stages of life itself. You have to recognize the appropriateness of where you are in time. This card is also associated with Alexander, who was known for his triumphal marches of all kind. You know, the victor. And it's interesting, the Golden Dawn has this guy with horns on his head. You have stars in the Rider-Waite, but that's again the notion of being led by this sort of higher self.
How do you connect this to Cancer?
Well, the way it works is Saturn working through the intensity, the emotional intensity of Cancer, which is this, you know, that lunar power, but it's also the sun at midsummer, just in terms of where it is, right? So it's cardinal water. Through those harnessing those powerful emotions, you know, to then an active willingness to confront the self, right? Mars. So, yeah, and one has to be willing to enter into a profound, intense emotional state. But it's one in which you're being guided. It's the process of analysis, actually. I mean, when I think about it, you know, it's a process of analysis where you allow yourself to move into profound states in which you watch, self-observe, and create appropriate container for yourself. Does that make sense? Good. All right.
Because Cancer is like a mirror. Is that?
Well, Cancer is ruled by the moon. So, and moon is, yes, a reflection. It's also, if you remember, cardinal water, tremendous force, intensity. Yeah.
Yeah, what was the relationship with Mars in the chariot there with, you talk about it with Saturn and Cancer?
Yeah. So here's Saturn acting through Cancer on Mars.
Oh.
Okay? So Mars is Gevurah. And that's, so it's, and there again, think about Saturn as containment, right? So it's learning to contain the emotional intensity represented by Cancer so that we have a Mars that isn't destructive. Because that's the problem with revolutionaries, is they get caught up in their rage and their anger, and they start offing people. Right? It's really a problem. I was just thinking about it. I just finished reading a book about the Russian Revolution. It was just and I started thinking about, you know, how revolution often becomes devolution. Things devolve because you just completely wreck infrastructure. There has to be another model for revolution. So if we want to have a peaceful, if we want to have a constructive criticism revolution, see, revolution is supposed to be a renaissance of the evolutionary process of civilization as represented by this. But unfortunately, all too often it becomes devolution, a breakdown, right? And the way that we avoid that is by containing that revolutionary fervor, containing the intensity of the emotion so that we can do a process of active self-confrontation instead of projecting it all out onto everybody else, right? So it's really easy to demonize the other, and that's when you start dragging people out and shooting them. You demonize the other. And the Chariot is about a kind of triumphance that does not crush others. It's a healthy triumph. Does not involve destroying. That's what the Chariot in its positive sense is about. In its negative sense, it's I'm riding high and I'm calling the shots. Yes! Not a good thing, right? In fact, in a negative, one of the other images that underlies the Chariot is the Dionysian. Dionysus, one of his old names was, I wrote it down because I'd forgotten it. Where is it? Yeah, he was called, somewhere in here, it's in here. Well, he had a name. Triumphus something or other, and I don't have it, which is really infuriating. But at any rate, what happened was Dionysus had this, the other image for this, the triumphal stuff, was Dionysus conquered India. And he went on this beautiful triumphal march through India, which Alexander, in fact, was imitating when he did his triumph through Persia. And he was a very deliberate imitation on his part. He took all of his closest companions, and they were in this huge kind of like a float thing, you know, that he made. And they were riding through the streets, and they were partying on this thing. So they were like Dionysus and his Bacchids, you know, the followers, the wild followers. But the thing that happens to Dionysus is his triumph goes out of control, and he actually gets torn apart by his own maenads. And that's what happens when we become arrogant. We lose control. And then the whole thing blows up in our face. That's the shadow side of this card. You know, it's the complacency, it's the certainty that I'm right. And it's the might as right. Right? That's so again, looking at the courtly love story about how it's the, you know, having things led by inspiration as opposed to might being right. Well, the triumph can represent in its shadow side, the might is right. I'm in control, therefore I'm calling the shots and I must be right because I'm in control. Right? Very important card. Very important card. All right, we're done. Okay, so now we're going on to our next card, Strength and the Hermit. And Strength and the Hermit. Okay, I'm going to have to gather my thoughts. Strength is one of our crossbars, which is a really important one. And so it runs from Gebra to Hesed. And it's the balance, appropriately enough, between mercy and justice, between the building up energy of Jupiter and Hesed and the confrontational, breaking down force of Mars. And so that's an interesting thing. Then the other one, the pair to the Strength card, is the Hermit, which is between Hesed and Tiferet. And there are some things that are very similar about these cards. They both represent an internal process in which one has to really work on oneself. In the case of the Hermit, it leads to an act of service. The Strength card is all about an internal balancing between the two poles of our being, between that urge to build up, to be constructive, and the urge to confront and blow things apart. Let's start with Strength. So Strength is governed by Leo. So this is another one of our zodiacal cards. Its Hebrew letter is Teth, or snake. And the Hebrew letter also has attributed to it the sense of taste, which is sort of interesting. So when you think about strength, and there's a way where one gets a taste for certain kinds of experiences, it means that sort of thing. One of the things that's really interesting about the Strength card is a very fun variation. So in most cards, what you're going to see is some variation of woman and, whoops, I'm a little shaky from that coffee, woman and lion. Kind of an interesting combination. The lion representing, of course, the physical It represents the body, it represents vitality, lust at a certain level, and the woman, again, representing this more civilizing in soul principle. Crowley has a little bit of fun with it, and this is an example of where you have to be a little careful about Crowley. He has the card as the woman riding on the back of the beast, which of course he names Lust, and he's, the scarlet woman riding upon the back of the beast. And actually, I think he's kind of poking fun at people, but really what the lion is about in alchemy, the lion is always associated with the sun, with nobility, and with strength. But there's also this sense of soothing the savage beast. And so what this is about is strength that comes not from power over, not from the overpowering, but from making contact and being connected to. And the stories that underlie this, there are many of them actually, but one of the more famous ones is the story of Androcles and the lion. But there are variations of this story everywhere. And so Androcles and the lion is the one where, Androcles comes upon the lion, the savage beast, but what happens is that he sees that the lion has a thorn in its paw. And so he feels sorry for the lion and he pulls the thorn out of its paw. And then later on, I'm trying to remember, I may be mixing this up with a couple of different myths, but I think stories, what happens is he gets, becomes a Christian, he gets thrown into the amphitheater where he's going to be eaten by the lions, and lo and behold, one of the lion that's about ready to eat him is the lion that he rescued, and so, everything works out swell. But there are many versions of this in fairy tales. It's about befriending, something that is potentially dangerous. And through the befriending of that potentially savage creature, a bond is formed. And so one of the, if you look at a lot of the cards, you'll see the woman is controlling the lion with a wreath of flowers. So what this is really, and this is interesting also when we think about going back to, what was our card? Our card for the Fool, right? Where the little boy has the wolf on the leash. And there's a kind of innocence. In this case, the control is exercised through the act of compassion. So this is about finding one's strength through the ability to have a compassionate identification with the other. That makes a lot of sense when we start to think about how Geburah is the force of the revolutionary, and Hesed is the force of civilization. When the powers that be, when the civilizing forces, when the authority structures can have compassion for those who are oppressed, revolution in its destructive sense is averted. When the revolutionary is able to see the other not as simply somebody to be knocked over, knocked down, or disposed of, then we have a different kind of peaceful revolution. On the level of soul, this is about self-acceptance and compassion. That the way to really balance ourselves is not through being harsh, being, putting the thumb screws to ourselves. It's for having compassion. And anybody who's ever worked with an addictive process knows what I mean by this. It's when we have compassion for the wounded parts of ourselves, for the addicted parts of ourselves, that we can actually begin to work in a creative and useful way. That's what this card is about. It's a really, really important card. And what else do I want to say about that? Let's see. This card, in its positive sense, represents courage, strength, spiritual strength, and being able to, and again, balance oneself in a compassionate way. Now, one of the things that we have to think about this card is one of the more positive, in my opinion, of the trumps. It's almost hard to find a way in which it lacks compassion. But when you think about this in an unbalanced way, I'm thinking think about Leo, the lion. And there is that way where Leonine people are very, very charismatic. Yeah, and there's a kind of a showing off, yeah. And there can be a level at which this kind of strength can become distorted into a way that in which one makes others feel seen and helped, and yet it serves some form of subversion, getting them to go along with you. This can be a card of seduction. So that's it's rare to see it in that way, but it can happen. So instead of the leonin leading through compassion and example and identification, there's that kind of glamorous look at me and you can be like me, and getting people on board in that way. So it's a misapprehension of strength. The Hermit, oh, I love the Hermit. This is one of my favorite cards. The Hermit is Virgo, which is probably why I like it so much. And so this is attributed to the Virgos. Its Hebrew letter is Yud, which is symbolic of the hand of man that reaches out. It's the open hand. And the sense associated with it is touch. And that's a very curious thing when you consider that when we think about hermit, don't we usually think of somebody who's sort of like isolated? Well, that's because we're not thinking about hermit in the old-fashioned sense of the word. Okay? So who is a hermit? Well, first of all, and one of the things I always think of when I look at this card, and those of you who are Tolkien aficionados, Gandalf the Grey. Mm-hmm. All right, so who's the hermit? All right, well, let's talk about that for a moment. So, and here it is coming from Hesed. Right up here we have the Hierophant, right? The Hierophant, or the priest, has the answers to what you need in the institutional form. Now, if you lived in the Middle Ages, and you lived in a village, and you had a problem, and you wanted to get advice, you had two sources. The first was the village priest, who was probably one of the few people who was educated. And you went to the village priest and you said, you know, Father, I'm having a problem, blah, 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 blah. And he gave you what was probably the best institutional answer of the day. The answer that was going to come from the established authority. But maybe you had a problem that didn't fit, that couldn't really be resolved by recourse to those institutionalized answers. You had a problem that was somehow out of the box. What you did then is you went to the local hermit, the local wise woman or wise man, the guy who lived outside the walls of the village. Hermits went off by themselves for two reasons. One is that they wanted to seek their own internal contemplation and their own development and their own inspiration, which was something that was not to be had within the structure of the institutions of their time. The other reason why a hermit went outside the village walls is so he or she could do what they needed to do without being messed with. So the hermit existed outside the system and had answers that were outside the system. They were outside the box, but they were nonetheless respected. They did have a place in that world. And everyone understood that, at least until we started torching witches and things like that. So, it used to be that, you sort of had your priest and he handled a lot of the typical stuff. And then you had your wise person, and that was the person that you went to when you had some kind of weird problem that was really out of the box that you just couldn't get dealt with. And so here, the hermit, though, like the Hierophant, was in a sense a servant. The hermit served the greater structure, the greater civilization, but did it in this out-of-the-box way. So it was a path of service. It was a path of giving. And one of the things that's symbolic about that, when you look at the Waite card, or actually you look at either card, the Golden Dawn has it too. First of all, you have this robed figure like a monk, or in a sense, and you have the cincture, the belt. That's particularly true in the Golden Dawn. The cincture, or the belt, the cord, which is something that people who are initiates wear, is a symbol of service. The other thing that you see is that in both these cards, the hermit holds a lamp, which is symbolic of the lamp of knowledge. And the hermit carries that lamp into the dark corners and carries that lamp out into the wastelands and is like a lighthouse for those who are off wandering distant paths. The hermit also, the fact that the hermit travels in a sense, even if it's only in the sense of in their own internal pathways. The staff, once again we see the staff. We see the staff a number of times. We see it in the Fool, but it's a staff that's not grounded on the ground. It's over the shoulder. He's traipsing gaily along. This is a very firmly grounded staff, right? And so once again we have this. This is another version of the quester, but this is an internal quester. This is someone who goes, puts on his cap and his walking shoes and goes seeking knowledge in unknown and mysterious places. The hermit comes up when people feel the need to step outside the normal life that they've been living and to seek a deeper and a more true answer. It's a very, very important kind of card. The other thing that's true about the hermit, though, that one needs to remember, and Virgo, of course, being a card of service, the other thing that one needs to remember is the downside of it is isolation. Now, a healthy hermit is anything but isolated. There's, a stream of people coming to his or her door, right? But sometimes people, in their desire to go inward and seek their own knowledge, literally do pull themselves away in the more modern sense of that word, where you cut yourself off. And of course, this was never considered a very valid spiritual path. Even if you remove yourself in a monastery where you are completely secluded, you are still supposed to be, in a sense, in contact with the world, if nothing else, through your active service of prayer. But the idea of the hermit is not that you're going to go off and lead your own selfish little, self-illumination. It's that you seek illumination and you keep bringing it back as a teacher. You keep bringing it back to others. And so sometimes this can be this can be aspected badly, and it becomes a card of selfishness. We all know people like that. And one of the things that I find interesting is that in the Buddhist tradition, they always talk about that, where they say, nobody can really become illuminated until everybody is illuminated. And the hermit is about that as well. And so again, if we look at the two poles, one serves, one becomes self-sacrificing, and then through that path, you sort of begin to step outside. You no longer need all the rules and the regs. You've kind of outgrown them. And you come into your own internal authority, your own system. You build up your own hesed, right? Or you can look at it coming down the tree. It's this inner authority, this constructive energy that then, through the path of active service, is brought down to help illuminate others, right? So that's one way of looking at those two. But you'll notice that both of those cards at a certain level are really about identification with others. The hermit does it in this rather unique standing apart but with way, right? Then let's move on to the Wheel of Fortune.
What about Yod?
Yod. Oh yeah, Yod. Well, Yod, again, as I said, represents the open hand. But Yod also is the first letter of the Tetragrammaton, which is an important thing to remember. It's that creative seed. I always think of Yods as they look like sperms, little sperms, And the Yod is the first letter is fire, right? So it is creating change. It is creating, it is a pure sort of energy. And the hermit becomes inseminated, in a sense, with his or her own knowledge, right? It's primal. It's not derivative. They go seeking their own. So one of the things that happens with a hermit is a hermit starts with, a set of disciplines and practices, but then goes out in the world and through interacting with the world really begins to create his or her own systems. Really. And that is an interesting card. One of the reasons why I feel a tremendous identification with this card is, of course, I am a Virgo, but also I'm very much a systems thinker. And so for me, I learned these various systems I learn Neidan, I learn Chinese medicine, I learn Hermeticism, and then I go off and start refashioning it in a sense. You know, it becomes, and this is what anybody does when you work toward mastery, is you make something your own. You internalize a system of knowledge, and then you have to make it your own, in a very real way, which I also think is about what the Hermit is about. All right, let's talk about the Wheel of Fortune. Oh, I love this card. And where are my notes on that? Chariot. Okie dokie. Oh, there it is. Where's the Wheel of Fortune? All right. Anybody here ever read the Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy? I guess you had. This is in the old days when we had to read that kind of stuff. All right. That's Boethius was a very, 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 very early Christian. And he was thrown in prison. I'm trying to think. This was like in the Roman era. I mean, really a long time ago. And he wrote a book called On the Consolation of Philosophy. And the whole wheel, a lot of the Wheel of Fortune iconography comes out of that book. It became a very important book. St. Augustine read it. All of the early church fathers read it. It became very, very important. And the idea, and this is also something that appeared in the very early Golden Verses of Pythagoras, which is probably the central Hermetic ethical text, which was written down, we think, for the first time sometime in the 1st or the 2nd century AD. And the part that refers to this, let me think about this. Avails the goddess Fortune, gives to man, bear meekly thou thy lot, nor complain of it, but cure it as thou canst. Remember this, fate gives the least of evil to the good. How sad for men with countless woes are carried by its wheel, and up and down we go. I forget, I'm getting it a little screwed up. And bitter inborn strife companions us and does us secret harm. You know, provoke it not, O human, but yield, and in yielding find escape. So the idea about the Wheel of Fortune is that the Wheel of Fortune is simply the movement of events. And that one moment you're on top and the next moment you're on the bottom. And one of the things is that you have to, this is very Buddhist also, you actually have to develop a certain detachment. You cannot be attached to success. That we all have successes, we all have failures, and none of them are really failures unless we fail to learn. That's a failure. And one of the things that's very interesting about the notion of the Wheel of Fortune is that this is a very Hermetic idea, you guys, and it's a really important one. And that is that, you know, there's a very popular belief, which has been popularized to some degree by things like that modern movie, The Secret, which is that you create your own reality, you bring everything into being. Hermeticism does not believe that. Really doesn't. Reality is a whole lot bigger than you are, you know? And if you want to think you can create reality, fine, go stub your toe on it, and then you'll know. Reality is reality. Things happen, events happen, they're very big movements. They're movements of cultures, they're movements of time, they're movements in evolution. Big. You cannot control that. What you can control is your response to it. That is what you can control. That's what it means when it says fate brings the least of evil to the good, because evil exists in the realm of the moral. Thunderstorms aren't evil. They're bad luck, or we don't like them. You know, they destroy things, but they're not evil. Evil is something that it has to exist in the realm of humans. And so, you know, you may have bad things happen to you, but it isn't really evil unless you are organized in such a way that you cannot digest that experience in a positive manner, right? Fate brings the least of evil to the good. What happens with the good is everything, every experience is grist for the mill. Every experience is the opportunity to find that gold, that philosopher's gold. You transmute your experiences into learnings, and then there is no such thing as a bad experience. So that's where you have to be with it. And so the Wheel of Fortune is about several things. It's about learning to be detached from the movement of events and to establish high thy mind, again, that best of charioteers, to recognize that your focus needs to be above the wheel in a sense. If you focus on where I'm at on the wheel, you're going to spend a lot of time chasing your tail. And that's a big problem. One thing that's interesting about the difference between the two cards is in this card, which is the Rider-Waite, what you have is you have the 8-spoked wheel. The 8-spoked wheel is symbolic of the seasonal tides, the seasons of the year. And there again, we have to ride the seasons of the year, the seasons of our life. Right? We have to go with that. And it also has the Hebrew letters of the Tetragrammaton, earth, air, fire, water. Symbolic, of course, of the great solstices, or the cross-quarter days in this case. And then you also have the letters T-A-R-O, but it's set up in such a way that it's tarot, but it's constantly turning, ever moving. Is the T is both the beginning and the end of the word. And so on the Golden Dawn card, the wheel is actually the wheel of the zodiac, 12 spokes, right? Pretty much the same meaning. You're moving around through phases, right? And then on the card, this card, the Rider-Waite card, we have the 4 cherubim. We have the bull, the man, the ox, the bull, the human, the lion, and the eagle or phoenix, depending on how one views it. That's just, again, symbolic of the 4 elemental forces. And
I find
this,
it interesting, each has a book though too. You look.
yes, right. Well, that's because these experiences give us knowledge. That's the whole point of experience. Why are we here on earth? To have experiences and learn from them. All right, so, but when we come down, we are subject to the wheel. Which, this card, you have a couple of things. On the bottom of the card, you have this funny little figure, which is supposed to be a dog-faced ape. And what the dog-faced ape is that was the underworld companion of the god Hermes. And he symbolizes time and eternity. And the idea is that, once again, if we identify with myth, if we identify with the deeper journey, then we don't get caught up in being too devastated by whatever's going on in the turning of the wheel. Because we realize that there's all of time and eternity. And you're going to be through all those phases. You also have a Sphinx in both cards. The Sphinx is above on this one. And again, the Sphinx is representative of the guardian of the mysteries. So the whole point, and this card is, let's see, did I say what its Hebrew letter was? And it's Kaf, the fist. So if the Hermit was the open hand, this is the fist. It's also kind of representative in some ways of karma a little bit. There's also another aspect of karma that we're going to talk about later when we talk about the Justice card, which is definitely, actually it's the next card, which is Lamed, the Ox Goad, which is a polite way of talking about cattle prod. So the Wheel of Fortune we get hit by it, and it's hard. You have to learn to really roll with this card. It's a very important card for that reason, and it goes between Hesed and Netzach. Let's think about that for a moment. So Netzach, if we're going up the wheel, Netzach is we have a dream, we have a vision, and then we have to go through all the ups and downs before we can actually rise up to a higher level of order. So you can have, and this is what I always call, there's what the people that I call the workshop junkies. So you go to these workshops where you have like illuminations, right? You go to the forum, not to diss the forum has some really nice things, but you go to the forum and you get it about your family or whatever. You have this big realization. But if you don't take it out in the world and go through all the ups and downs and play with the realization, and integrate it into your life, you never arrive at a higher level of order. If, on the other hand, you do take that vision, that illumination that you had in that moment, and you really work it, you work it for good and for bad, you work it through all your experiences, and you let yourself be buffeted around and you still manage to hang on to it, then you get to a higher level of being. So this can be a card of destiny and success in the deepest sense. Destiny as in you are able to live out your myth no matter what life throws at you. Or it can be just the opposite. It can be in the negative sense where you're just completely reactive. So here's the deal. Life comes at you and you can either be awake and conscious and craft your response and learn what you learn, or you can bounce around like a ping pong ball. One moment happy, one moment sad, one moment sublime, one moment in the pits. Up to you. But it's all about rising above the wheel and being able to view experiences. The Hermetic philosophers talk about this a lot in the Kybalion, when we talk about rising above the pendulum. And the idea of the pendulum is just like the wheel. Things are constantly swinging. You know, good to bad, happy to sad, blah, 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 blah. And you either are on the pendulum or you can rise above it and observe the swing of the pendulum from above. Doesn't mean you don't have feelings, but it means that you're not at the mercy of them. That's the importance of this card. So people sometimes are stuck on the wheel. And in fact, in Buddhism, they describe it that way. They say you're stuck on the wheel of life. And then when you also think about the wheel in a really fairly gross sense, you can think about people were put on, literally, on wheels. It was a form of the rack. And by the way, this card is ruled by Jupiter. Remember how we talked about Jupiter is that very, very expansive force. And it can be a very lucky energy, or not. All right, so here we have the fists. I love that sort of the open hand and the fist. Interesting pairs, aren't they? And then we move on to
Could you talk a little bit just about the little red guy in the bottom of the wheel there?
you know, I'm trying to remember who the heck that is. I think
Okay.
it's supposed to be a form of Anubis,
Okay.
which is you know, the jackal god. And what Anubis is, yeah, it is, that's who it is actually. I don't know why they made him red though. Usually Anubis is black. But the idea is that it's about, what does a jackal do? A jackal goes and eats like dead stuff and then digests it. And Anubis is about taking in experiences that might even be very toxic and digesting them and turning them into life. So that's about that. And so, and then, yeah, it's kind of an interesting picture. You have the Sphinx holding the sword on top of the wheel, and that is about being on top of the cycles and using the intellect and the mind. Then on the bottom you have Anubis, but Anubis is coming up, and that's the necessity for digesting experiences. And coming down is the serpent, which, remember, we descend. So we descend into form, and then we have to have experiences which we digest, which then carries us up to the wheel, and then we have that moment of illumination where we understand the mysteries of life, and then we're back down, right? So it's a cyclical thing. So that's what it is. So it's the cycle of knowledge.
How do you pronounce that Hebrew letter?
Which one?
Yod.
Or cup.
Yod or Kaf?
Kaf.
Kaf. Kaf. All right. Now we move on to, I'm going to get these, well, okay. Now we move on to our next two, which are Justice and the Hanged Man. Oh boy, this is one of my favorite cards. I keep saying that, don't I? I do the same thing with herbs. It's really pretty silly. Yeah. And so there again, now justice is over here. Gabara to Tiferet. And appropriately enough, justice is, Hebrew letter is Lamed, the ox goad. And like I said, it's a nice way of talking about the old cattle prod. And so Gabara, in a sense, is like the cattle prod. It's that confrontation. It's that Mars energy that really kind of gooses us, and gooses us pretty hard. And then we pass through this transition, this phase of justice, and it brings us to Tiferet, which again is divine service. It's the enlightenment in a sense. Or we can look at it the other way, which is, through this process of becoming divine and compassionate and having an illuminated being, we then have to create structures which call to account both ourselves and the system and others. So justice is a calling to account. This card is also very strongly associated with karma. It's a little bit different from the Wheel of Fortune. How is that? Well, the Wheel of Fortune is about just the fact that we have lots and lots and lots of experiences, and that's how we build up knowledge. This is karma in the sense that we have experiences that are painful and difficult, and they goad us to grow. They goad us to reorganize at a higher level where we become, in a sense, the bar that holds others accountable and ourselves as well. So think about that for a moment. Justice is all about things being in balance for all people. So this is karma in the sense of the teacher or the instructor. Now let me say a word about karma here, because this is very important. This is a very seminal Hermetic concept. Mostly when we think about karma in the popular sense, what we say is, oh boy, this rotten thing happened to me, and we view it as a punishment. I did something wrong and now I'm reaping my karma. And we'll often say, when we think somebody's been bad, we'll say, well, they'll get theirs, karma always comes around, karma comes home to roost. That's actually kind of the opposite of the way we think about karma in the Hermetic tradition. Karma doesn't actually exist that way at all. The way it exists is like this. You have experiences. Happy experiences are generally what happens after you've learned a lesson. Okay? Hard experiences are the lesson. And it isn't a lesson like, bad you, I'm going to teach you. It's like, okay, so I'm going to take this on a global sense. Your soul has decided it's going to incarnate. You're ready for another round of experience. There we are, once again. So you descend, like the Wheel of Fortune, you descend, and you go into some experiences. The experiences generate confrontations. They generate things that you need to come up against to grow. So maybe in your last life, you learned how to be, generous and kind and whatever. And now maybe the experiences that you need to have right now is how to be tough, how to be the tough mom, how to be loving in a way that calls others to account, right? So what happens? You give birth to a kid who turns out to be the original wild child of the universe, and you spend, their entire adolescence clutching your head and going, what did I do to deserve this? But anyhow, you get the tough experience. The tough experience is an opportunity to achieve a higher level of organization. When you learn it, you get relief. You get the reward. You get the good thing. So bad karma, in a sense, is not about you getting punished for screwing up a lesson. If you screw up a lesson, yes, you're going to have to confront it again. Not as a punishment, but because you didn't get it. We all know this about relationships, right? So, you have that stupid relationship where you fall in love with a person who just, is completely selfish, could care less, And if you're smart, and you suffer, and if you're smart, you figure it out. And then, I'm not doing that again. And you go on and you meet somebody else and you have a happy relationship. But of course, mostly we don't do that. What we do is we go on and we pick yet another version of the same stupid thing. And we continue to get that piece of rotten karma until we have the little light bulb moment where we go, oh, wow, I don't have to do that. Yes. All right. So that's a little bit about what justice is about. Justice is the iconography of this card. Goes back to Themis, the Greek goddess of justice. She was many things actually. Themis was a titaness. And remember I told the story a little bit ago about Kronos and how he was swallowing his kids and all that. And finally, Gaia got in cahoots with Rhea and they fed him the stone baby and so on and so forth. So he swallowed the stone baby. Meanwhile, Rhea had to hide Zeus until he was big enough to come up against Dad. So one of the guardians and protectors of Zeus was Themis. Justice is about providing protection so that the right can flourish. We have law because human beings are not evolved enough to treat each other decently. So we have to legislate stuff, right? So that's one of the things that Themis did. She also had a prophetic gift, and she did a stint where she was running the Oracle of Delphi until Apollo came along, and then she said, oh, thank God, please take this over. She's one of the great triple goddesses, and in that regard, she's a bit like Isis. But mostly, Themis is seen as being an analog of Ma'at. Ma'at was the Egyptian goddess of justice, and she was also considered to be the wife of Thoth, or at least the female companion, or sometimes considered to be another version of Thoth. But anyway, Ma'at, when you went down into the underworld, what would happen is your heart, the human heart, was placed in the scales of Ma'at, and on one side was your heart, on the other side was a feather. And what you were hoping would be, that your heart would be light. But if you had a lot of bad, accumulated a lot of experiences, then you would be judged. So, but this is not so much, I think, a card about judgment in that sense. Although there is judgment implied in it. It's really more about judgment that sees the spirit, the true spirit that underlies law. Another story that's very important in understanding this card is the story of Solomon. So, I don't know how many of you know this story. It's a great story. So, two women come to Solomon with a baby, right? And they're both saying, this baby is my baby. That other, woman stole my baby. Give me back my baby, blah, blah, blah. And Solomon, who is considered to be, in the Bible, was the wisest human. Solomon had to make a judgment. So what Solomon did is he said, okay, I got it. Bring me my sword. There's the sword, right? And he says, I'm going to cut the baby in half, and then you each get half of the baby, and then that'll be fair. This is the difference between fair and right. So one of the women goes, oh my God, don't do that. Go ahead, let her have him. And the other woman's like, yeah, okay. So Solomon gives the baby, says to the woman who protested, he says, okay, that's the mother, give her the baby. Now everybody goes, oh yeah, isn't that smart? Solomon finally figured out, who the mother was because she was the one who really cared. Wrong. Solomon didn't care who the mother was. Solomon knew that the baby belonged with the person who cared. Right? That's justice. So justice is different than legal who wins. And we all know that sense of frustration when something goes through the courts and you get an answer that's legally correct but that's really unjust. That's a failure of human justice, right? So this is the kind of justice this card implies. All right? And that's an important distinction to make. This is a card of Libra, which is a card of balance, right? So once again, when we look at this card, and it's interesting, again, where we look at where it is on the tree. It is about achieving true justice that holds ourselves and our societies accountable to something that is higher than, it's mine, right? It's a higher level of justice. It's a level of justice that we're reaching for, that we're trying very much to find in human societies at this time on the planet. We're not doing a very good job. Anyway, the next, this is the Hanged Man, okay? Card number 12. And it's the pathway here between Deborah and Hood, which is Mercury again, Mars, Mercury, severity and splendor. And its Hebrew letter is Mem, which means water or seas. And this is a card of water. Remember I said there were 3 elemental cards? Aleph, the Fool, is there. This is water. The final one is also on this side of the tree. It's the down there. It's Judgment, Shin, which is fire. And so that's a kind of an interesting thing. But anyway, okay. So let's talk about the Hanged Man. This is and here's another thing that's fascinating. Once again, we have a hand thing cropping up, which is the Hand of Glory. Do you guys know what the Hand of Glory is? If you've ever watched Wicker Man, you've probably seen it. But that, by the way, is a very fun film. The Hand
The
of Glory.
original one.
The original one, yeah. The Hand of Glory was when they cut off the hand of a person who had been hung for thievery. And then you would render the hand into tallow and make a candle out of it, or alternatively, you light the fingers. And thieves, if they made a Hand of Glory and they went into a house and lit it, they would become either rendered invisible, that's one version of the story, or the other version of the story would be that everybody would fall asleep, which is what happens in The Wicker Man. So that's an interesting thing. And thieves are associated with the Hanged Man. And the Hanged Man, this goes back to Norse myth. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But hanged men were sacrifices to Odin. And so, and they used to believe that anybody who was hung would, after they died, become a companion of Odin in his storm god aspect. So Odin has many aspects, one of which is rather scary. And that's his storm god aspect, where he sort of roves around the earth with this roving crew of not very nice folks and wreaks a fair amount of havoc. So, and there's a lot of interesting stuff about this. But one thing I want you to notice right away, look at the leg position. It's an inversion of the emperor, right? So that's a curious kind of thing. So the emperor becomes powerful and leads others by, establishing this centralized control. The hangman is just the opposite. The hangman surrenders and achieves power. Okay, let's talk about it. This is just such a cool card. Let me find. Oh, hey, Justice. That's interesting. I just realized when I looked at the Golden Dawn Justice, the figure of Themis has her feet sitting on a jackal. So that's kind of curious. All right, where's the hangman? Here's the hangman. Ooh, that's beautiful. You see the Hebrew letter? It's the surround. And but otherwise a very simple figure. One thing, okay, let's talk about it. First of all, I want to start by saying that the hangman at the deepest level represents when you have to surrender willingly to a process of suffering in order to gain a handle on yourself, to find your innate power. This is symbolic of the willful initiation that you see in many primitive societies, where, for example, a medicine man will, did you ever see Billy Jack? That's a wonderful. If you haven't, that's again a really interesting movie because it actually has a scene where a young Indian warrior man decides to go through a shamanic initiation in which he allows himself to be bitten repeatedly by a rattlesnake. And then, of course, he sits in meditation and goes into and attains his own internal power and vision. What's interesting about the movie is that the man who played that, who was indeed a good martial artist, said he was willing to. They got elders of the Indian tribe to agree to actually do a ceremony so they could film it. But they said they would only do it if the actor was willing to actually undergo the ceremony. And this guy agreed. And it's fascinating because when you see it, you are seeing somebody really being bitten by a venomous rattlesnake. It's extraordinary. The filming crew was worried that they wouldn't get enough footage because you know how it is with film, you take a million takes. But they said that when the ceremony started, they all kind of went into trance. And they said they were shocked because they ended up having, this like a whole long thing. But anyway, it's an interesting thing. That's an example of the hangman. That kind of initiation where you willingly suffer pain, deprivation, whatever it takes in order to deepen yourself. The kind of vision quest that you're thinking about doing, Tammy, definitely hangman event. And the thing about it is, like water, like the force of water, you don't know where the experience is going to take you. You cannot predict it. It may kill you, but you do it anyway, right? Now, I'm going to tell you the story of Odin. This is directly, I'm going to read you a little bit, that it's directly taken from the Norse myth about Odin. Odin was the magician god, once again a Hermes figure, but kind of like a composite Hermes and Zeus in some ways. Anyway, Odin became the king of the gods by becoming a sorcerer, by attaining power. And what he did is he got the secret of the runes, the words of power, the incantations. And that's interesting because when we think about this pathway and we think about Mercury or Hood down here, it's about language as well as incantation, as well as science. So magic is science, really. It's just the science of manipulating the supernatural, right? So here's the verse. I know a 12. If a tree bear a man hanged in a halter, I can carve and stain strong runes that will cause the corpse to speak. Reply to whatever I ask. Oh, this isn't what I thought it was. Sorry about that. At any rate, let me just tell you the story and then that will make sense. So Odin decided, he went to the Yggdrasil. Ygr is the old name of Odin. Ygr, which becomes ogre in some stories. Anyway, Ygr hung himself on, so Yggdrasil is Ygr's tree. He hung himself on this tree, which as you can see is symbolic of the cross. This is also another analog of this would be Christ hanging on the cross. But the Yggdrasil was the world ash, the world tree. And it was the axis mundi, the center of all things. So, and there's a whole lot of stuff I could tell you about this tree. It goes on and on and on. But at any rate, he hangs himself on the tree for 9 days and 9 nights of suffering. But you will notice when you look at any of the portrayals of the hangman, nearly always, the face is serene. So it is a willful suffering. It is a chosen suffering. And one of the things that happened was, at the end of that time, he descends down the tree to the well of Mimir, the god of memory, and he has to drink from the well. In order to do so, he has to rip out one of his eyes and give it to him. And then he drinks and he has the vision of his runes, which he is then able to grasp, and he comes back. And that's why you always see Odin with a black eye patch. And what's symbolic about that is we have to give up some of our external vision in order to gain inner vision. The words of power, the incantory force, the word of creation. And if you study magic at all, over and over again, you will see this thing that to know the name of something is to have power over it. That's about incantations. And that's what this little verse I read to you was about. One of the things that's really interesting is this notion that there's also sort of a necromancy to it. That the idea is that if somebody's hung, the power is you can bring the dead man to speak. You can actually bring the dead man to speak. And that's what Odin's talking about when he says, "I know a 12th," meaning a 12th rune. "If a tree bear a man hanged in a halter, hung, I can carve and stain strong runes that will cause the corpse to speak, reply to whatever I ask." So this is the power to gain access to the realm of the dead. That again is like Persephone going into the underworld and gaining knowledge. It's gaining knowledge of prophecy comes from the deep unconscious mind, right? And so that is what Odin managed to get. So what this is about is the achievement of power through a willing suffering, the crucifixion of the self. It is the crucifixion of the small ego, the small I, in order to gain power and knowledge. And here again, if we look at this on the tree, when we have, remember how we talked about Hud, the scientist, one of the dangers of Hud is not being in touch with meaning. It's just doing stuff because you can. But this is the absolute inverse. It's completely opposite. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to get the big picture. And once again, it brings oneself to a higher level where one is confronted with one's shadow and must embrace it. And if we look at it as going down the tree, we take the self-confrontation of Mars, and we put it through this process of suffering. So then rather than being the revolutionary and it's you and it's you and it's you and it's you that we have to fix, it's me. I have to be fixed. I have to sacrifice, right? Here's an example, kind of a bad one perhaps, but I've been thinking a lot about the problem of the world population. Or you say, terrible problem. Okay, so one way of doing it, one revolutionary way of doing it, which the Chinese government in fact tried to do, and which we, who are now having birth rates that are falling, are likely to do, is to say, well, those stupid Indians, Chinese, or whatever, if they would we should go over there and, make them sterilized and blah, 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 say we're going to cut off aid unless you move. Right. There's the revolutionary. The hangman is to say, there are too many people here. Let us willingly have fewer people. Let us give money and aid to all these people who are suffering because of their high populations. Invite them to come to other places. Help them resettle. Let us give willingly of our wealth so we can raise their standard of living, because in fact, when the standards of living go up, birth rates go down. We've seen it over and over and over again. Very different kind of solution, right? If they just fix themselves, no, can't do it, right? So that's what that's about. That's what the hangman is about. Of course, the obverse, the bad part of it, the negative, is martyrdom. Sometimes people self-sacrifice to the point where they're actually removing a resource. So that's a problem. And that's a problem. It's a thorny problem. It's a problem that Gandhi had to wrestle with. Because Gandhi was willing to say, yes, I'll starve, I'll die in order to make a point. And then sometimes his followers had to come to him and say, Babaji, you can't do this. We need you. You're important. Gandhi had to find that balance. We all have to find that balance, right? So sometimes we sacrifice ourselves and we get to feel all good about our not being self-sacrificing, but what we're doing is we're depriving a really needed element in a given situation. Right? It's not about feeling good about yourself. It's about doing what's needed. That's the hangman.
Would a negative side of that be you come to a dead end, or whatever is in your life here, it's a dead end, or?
No, the funny thing about the Trumps are it's never a dead end. You can flunk a Trump, but it's just going to take you on to the next cycle of the wheel. Do you know what I'm saying? But the dead end here would be if you, instead of learning the lesson, so when Odin goes through his suffering, he goes through his suffering and he takes up power. And he doesn't go, oh, I've suffered and now I know some stuff. He becomes the king of the gods. And he not only becomes the king of the gods, he protects the gods from the forces of entropy. And it's because of Odin that he's able to hold off Ragnarok, the end of the world, for as long as he does in the Nordic myths. So it's very important that suffering is a good thing if it's a self-sacrificing thing and all of that stuff, but you have to pick up your power from it. Otherwise, what good did it do you? So if you suffer through your vision quest or being bitten by the rattlesnake to get your knowledge and stuff, and you don't pick up your power and do something with it, what was that about? You're just collecting initiations? I know people who do that too. Right? So you have to pick up your power. That's part of the lesson of the hangman. You've got to pick up your power and do something with it. Important. Very important.
Alfie, can
Yeah.
I bring up a question that I asked earlier, I guess?
Uh-huh.
So now this guy is facing in a direction, and you said directions that they were facing were important. Sorry, not in the in that deck yet.
Yeah, in the Golden Dawn. Okay, now here I'm going to have trouble. Is that right or left?
I don't know.
Somebody help me with this.
I'm right there with you. I don't know.
Well, it's to his left.
Yeah, he's looking to his left. Right, which in the west is looking to the yin, the feminine, water.
Okay, so you just think of it as yin and yang.
Yeah, yin and yang. Well, got to be a little bit careful because this is for anybody who knows Chinese medicine. This is a real mine. So in Chinese medicine, the right side is actually yin and the left side is actually yang. But in the West, the left side is the receptive and the feminine, and the right is the active. So he is looking to the left, isn't he?
Yeah.
Well, that would make sense because this is a card of water. So it's the feminine. It's the passive. He is allowing, in this position, Odin is passive. When he goes through his passive surrender, he then emerges in the opposite form, active. Passive precedes the active. Right? Which also has to do with this pathway on the tree. You know? You subject yourself to the disciplining force of Gabara, to that harsh winnowing, harrowing of the being, and then you come down to Hog where you start to do stuff. Right? Yes,
And
John.
his hands are tied then because he's in the passive mode?
Yes, yes. They're tied, I'm trying to think, in this one, they are tied behind his back. Interestingly enough, sometimes in some Wiccan versions of initiation, they, in some Masonic, I think too, they tie you up like this with your arms like that, which is, again, initiation. And I will tell you this, that in initiations of any kind, any real initiations worthy of the name, there is always a kind of, let's say, an element of suffering. It might be psychological, it might be physical, and there is a very practical reason for that, which is that when we look at altered state technologies, in order to do a state change, you have to disorient the person. You have to shake them out of their normal, mundane reality consensus. And one of the quickest, easiest ways to do that is with pain or fasting or sleep deprivation or, any of those things that we then turn into distortions when we use brain bending technique, right? But a lot of times shamans and people like that willingly induce these kinds of states by fasting or so on and so forth because, in fact, it induces what we call imprint availability. Makes one open to, it cracks you open, makes you open to new experiences. So the good news is that as we've learned more and more about hypnosis and about how you create altered states, we don't need to self-flagellate and starve ourselves and do all that stuff anymore because it's actually pretty easy to induce state changes, But in the old days, they did some pretty extreme stuff, which is why you had all those weirdos that would, do flagellate and put those guys who would stand on pillars and starve themselves and all that stuff because it was a way of inducing altered states. Thankfully, we don't need to do that anymore.
Childbirth,
What?
like when you have a baby.
Yes, childbirth is a great example of inducing in fact, that's a kind of a childbirth thing. You give birth to yourself as a mother by undergoing that experience, and you have to do it, and when you do it willingly, when you surrender to the process, which is what natural childbirth is all about, then you can have a profound state change. And here's one of the reasons why. This is just, again, a biochemical thing. So you have high levels of pain, your body cranks out massive amounts of endorphins, you breathe, you get through it, you give birth, and suddenly you're flooded with endorphins, and there's no pain. So you're high as a kite, which nature intended. Because then you look down at that little baby in your arms and you go, oh! Instant chemical bond. Huge. I don't know what happens for the baby. That's an interesting thought. Okay, so let's look at death. Death is the path from Tiferet to Netzach, and the Hebrew letter associated with it is Nun, which means fish. And death is, I just lost my thought. All right, let me come back to that. Scorpio. Thank you. It's ruled by Scorpio, which is a water sign, which is why that sort of fits with the fish. And Scorpios are really interesting because of all the water signs, the Scorpios are the ones, the fixed water signs, that are most comfortable swimming around in the depths. Scorpios are very, very, very deep. And death, the card death here, in some respects, this is again a card that sort of is reminiscent of the Hanged Man, which is a water card. This is a water card in that it's Scorpio. But the Hanged Man is about a willing submission in order to go through a change in consciousness. Death doesn't matter whether you're willing or not. You're going one way or the other. You have no choice. And that's why in many of the cards where you see death, you see variations on the Grim Reaper or, Death Triumphant. And the Rider-Waite one is kind of cool because it's got, if you look in the foreground, it's got like the Pope, or maybe it's a bishop, some high church official. It's got, children, it's got the beautiful maiden, it's got a king laying dead on the idea being nobody gets to avoid it. Rank will not help you. Nothing will help you. We all have to go through this experience. Okay? And ditto with this card. This is just another version of the Grim Reaper. So when this card shows up, we often get scared because first thing people think is, oh my God, somebody's gonna die. Well, nah. Maybe. Sometimes it means that. But really what it's about is a change in consciousness. And it's a good change in consciousness in the sense that it's a freeing up. So, one of the ways that you could think about it is if you're going up the tree from Netzach to Tiferet, what you are is you're shedding all that Venusian, illusion and, in a sense, Maya, all of our ideas about things go through this huge transition and we come into our true self. That's what death's about. And there's also a way when you think about this as a psychological process as opposed to physical dissolution, what happens is often our ideas about things, our vision of who we are, has to go through a great death. We have to let it die periodically in order to reorganize our egos at a higher level. I've been in this process this year. And this is what I always call, the reinvention of self. Periodically, we have to die. If you don't die psychologically, periodically, you become dead in a much worse sense. You become static. You cease to grow and change. This is a card of growth in a bizarre sort of way. But it's the growth that comes when everything you are is stripped away. When your identity has to dissolve in order for, now I'm going down the tree, Your identity has to dissolve in order to come to a new vision. There I am. That's me right now, and I'm sure you've all had these experiences. It's shattering. And part of what's so shattering about it, it's not like the hangman where you can kind of go, okay, I'm going to take this on. You just get booted into it. More often than not, right? Scorpio has a dual rulership of both Mars and Pluto. And I think that that's significant. There's tremendous vitality in this process. It brings you to a tremendous sense of vitality, oddly enough, but because it strips away everything that's unnecessary. And it's Plutonian, or Hades, the god of the underworld, in that it takes you down into those deep, dark, shadow parts of yourself where you have to come to terms with often explosive and uncomfortable materials. And if you try to deny it, Pluto erupts upward to seize you by the scruff of the neck, Persephone, and drag you down there. So you can go kicking and screaming, or you can choose. Various myths of descent. In the Persephone myth, she goes kicking and screaming in some versions, and in others she doesn't. Inanna is one, which is my favorite, which is a Sumerian myth. Inanna dances down there. Man, she's going with all of her May, her holy powers, and gate by gate by gate, they strip them away until she enters the underworld bent low. Well, there you go. This is about the systematic destruction of all your great little ego identifiers. Has to happen. Has to happen. So when card death comes up, you say to somebody, wow, well, you are in the grip of big change, my friend. And it may be profoundly disorienting, but it will take you, if you allow it, to a much higher level. And so in the Christian sense of the card, dying is not a bad thing. You die and you go to heaven. Well, we hope, right? Certainly, if you follow any of the mysteries, death is never a bad thing. As I am fond of saying to my children, look, dying is not hard. It's the living that's the tough part. You know, dying means, oh goody, I get a break. You know, although the process, that can be a little unpleasant. So, there we go. That's death. And death is balanced by temperance. This is a mysterious card, temperance. At least I always found it so. So if we have death being from Tiferet to Netzach, temperance is from Tiferet to Yesod. We're back on the middle pillar. And that would make sense, right? That temperance would be on the middle pillar. The way the pillars show up in this card, the Rider-Waite card, is in the two cups. One hand on the other hand. Also, 1 foot on the water, 1 foot on the earth, right? And interestingly enough, the Hebrew letter that is associated with this is Samek, which means prop, something you lean upon. Temperance is a prop, which is an interesting thing. Okay, well, what do we mean by temperance? First of all, temperance is not about abstention. Okay, so when we talk about like the early American temperance movement, what we talk about is people saying, okay, I'm swearing off the demon alcohol. That isn't temperance, that's abstention. They should have called it the Abstention League. It's not temperance. Temperance is doing things in a balanced way. And temperance is also about tempering one's being. It connects the sun and the moon, the emotional realm, the conscious realm. We need both. But the way to have both is to learn to temper one's reactions. To be able to find a balance between thinking and feeling. Doing and not doing. It's about balance between all the parts of the self. And it's right back here on the tree. So over on the sides here, we have all these extreme sorts of states. We have justice, we have the hangman, you know. These are extreme experiences. This is about balance. You know, so we start down here in the realm of the moon, of emotions, where everything is always changing, and we rise through this process of learning to balance our emotions, to balance ourselves, our bodies, our lives, and we come to a place where we're really able and willing to serve others. Because we come from a balanced place. You try to serve others when you're unbalanced, you always make a mess of it. You do too much, you do too little, you do it in the wrong way. And if you're descending the tree, another way of looking at it is you reach this place of ego. You've developed a strong sense of what it is you're supposed to do, and then you have to find a temperate way to bring it into being. Because sometimes what happens is we get so focused in what it is we have to do that we begin to deny all sorts of parts of ourselves. Never a good thing. It will bite you. It will bite you. So that would be temperance. It's a beautiful card. I love this card.
How is it related to Sagittarius? Is that
Oh, yeah. Sagittarius, mutable fire. Fire turning into water. So Sagittarius has the impulse to create, to act, but it's also shifting into the realm of emotions. And so it's again, Sagittarians, they're very direct shooters, but they have to learn how to modulate their flame. So one of the things that's funny about Sagittarians is they can be, and I find this in myself sometimes. I have a Sagittarius moon. And, Virgo tends to make me very measured in my words and my thoughts for the most part. But if I'm on an emotional tear, I can take words and eviscerate you. I really can. I've had to learn to modulate that. And I remember my mother saying to me when I was a little girl, saying, look, you have a tremendous ability to use language. You've got to be careful with it. And she was right. And Sagittarians can be really blunt, I mean, it's pretty funny, but pretty awful if you're on. Oh yeah, so it's learning to modulate that active fire, And I might add, it's modulating the active fire by also having, being in touch with the impact that fire has on the receptive. And that's that sun-moon thing. So here's the other thing that Sagittarians can do. They might not be mad at all, but they might just be incredibly enthusiastic, and you just charge in there to some poor receptive soul who happens to be on the receiving end of your enthusiasm, and you blow them out of the water. You really don't mean to, but you blow them out of the water. You destabilize them. Missionaries can do that. You rush in with all your enthusiasm, and it's not tempered by understanding the culture, the individuals, the circumstances. You're all about wanting to be helpful, and you really make a mess of it. That's temperance in a negative sense. When one is intemperate, right? Okay. There we go. That's beautiful.